Good morning and welcome to a very special interview show of The Prode. Just a few hours ago, US President Joe Biden has called Putin a murderous dictator, a pure thug who is waging an immoral war against the people of Ukraine, as reported by The Telegraph. Also, it's the day 23 of the Russia-Ukraine war and the situation is still very tense and there is no hope of a ceasefire as of now. To talk about this and much more about the Russia-Ukraine crisis, I'm joined by Professor Bann Seng Tan, who is a renowned expert on geopolitical affairs and international relations. Thank you, Professor, for your time and a very warm welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Ritwij. So as you have introduced me, I want to point out to my audience that I'm only speaking in the professional capacity as an academic. In this case, as an assistant professor of political science and international relations, I do not represent any official position of any country, and I do not represent, I'm not speaking on behalf of my university, Ashoka University. Now, when I think about the issue, when I approach international relations, I understand that there is a tendency to focus on topical issues, and few things are as attention-grabbing as war, right? It almost gets everybody's attention. My value to the audience, I hope, is that whether it is war, sanctions, or democracy, I would try, where possible, to use concepts that are anchored in existing international relations and political science literature. One particular way to the way I approach how to understand issues in IR, international relations, is that I don't accept the firewall between what is traditionally considered to be national security or international relations and what is usually considered to be domestic politics. Let me put it to you this way, in a way that may make sense to your audience. I argue that states don't make decisions, people do, right? When the leader like Putin makes decision, he's not just considering national security. He's also thinking about the impact of the war on his domestic politics, on his implications for political survival. So for me, when I understand international politics, it is an extension of domestic politics. To use an American expression, all politics is local, right? So that's the angle that I'm approaching this for. Thank you.
Thank you so much, sir. So, sir, I would like to begin the discussion by asking, what is your assessment of the current situation and what are your thoughts on the recent updates coming from Kiev about the Russian invasion?
Okay. Things, as you mentioned, are still fluid. It seems like right now the Russians are entrenching on the military side of the effort. The invasion is not proceeding according to plan, but we do not get a sense that Putin's side have any intentions of backing down in the near future. If I were to speculate on this, I think Putin is getting more and more worried about the domestic consequences for him. We can, of course, talk about the sanctions later, but the sanctions are biting, is hurting the Russian people, is generating protests at home, and the failed, I won't say it's failure because it's still ongoing, but the mismanaged invasion of Ukraine is now making Putin look bad. In order for him even to consider withdrawing from Ukraine, he needs to show, or at least have the appearance of showing, that he won a victory, right? So he needs a face-saving way to step down. As you are just hinted, the United States, by labeling Putin a war criminal, which in my opinion he is, that may not help things that much, because the United States is not supposed to negotiate with a war criminal. So the US the US and the Western side seems to have also entrenched. That is to say, they are at least enough not to apply military measures such as a no-fly zone that has the prospect of escalation, and they are sticking, from what I can tell, mostly to supply defensive supply of weapons to Ukraine, and mostly to the application of sanctions.
Okay, sir. So why is it so that the nations like USA, UK, France, etc. have decided not to send their military to help Ukraine? What could be the practical reason behind the move? As we all know that how all these countries combined have so much of hard power as well as firepower. So why is it so that these people have decided not to interfere militarily?
My guess is that this probably has to do with the lack of political will. Um, for a very long time, the West has been rather complacent in the defense of democracy. They are aware there has been a rise of authoritarian regimes throughout the world, I think, since 2006. 2006 is an important year because that's when, according to Freedom House Index, the number of democracies and the state of democracies, that means the quality of democracies, have been steadily declining since 2006. So this, in some of the political science literature, this is known as the democratic recession. The West have been quite complacent about the democratic recession. My guess is that the Russian invasion of Ukraine has now triggered some kind of awakening of the states, and that the democracies seem to be getting their act together. But because the Europeans and the Americans have very different priorities, for example, Europe is more dependent on Russian gas and oil compared to the United States, there is still an absence of political will to actually do anything that will escalate the conflict. So they are willing to provide passive, supply of military hardware, but they don't want to do anything that will promote a situation where the West, that means NATO, and the Russians actually come to actual conflict. Part of the reason is because they don't want a nuclear war or another third world war, right? So that I think is the key priority that the Western allies are very concerned with. This is the reason why before the fighting started, Joe Biden, President Biden, make it very clear, no matter what happened, there will be no American troops in Ukraine. And this was a fairly consistent position by them.
Yeah. So coming to sanctions, so why is it so that the Russian Federation doesn't fear the sanctions much? What could be the possible reason behind this, and how effective can sanctions be in order to solve the crisis between both the countries? What are your thoughts on this?
Sure. Now, with regards to sanctions, there is a lot to say. So I ask that my audience may have to bear with me as I elaborate on several points.
Yeah, sure.
So, thank you. One of the key, there has been a lot written on sanctions. Even at the beginning of the conflict, many of the pundits have been talking about how the sanctions on Russia is unlikely to achieve much. As far as I can tell, there are three main arguments, so to speak, in favor of the claim that the sanctions will not change that much with regards to Russia. So some of this is Russian propaganda, right? The first claim is that before the war, the Russians claim that their central bank reserve is approximately 631 billion US dollars, right? So this is something that they have been preparing for what they claim almost 10 years of preparation for this round of conflict. If that amount is true, it means that Russia has the fourth largest reserve in the world. It's almost as if they have a war chest, a war chest to draw upon to endure Western sanctions. The second reason why why people think that Russia would be immune to the sanction is because the Europeans depend on Russia for its energy needs. We know the figures that are regularly quoted in Europe. Europe depends on Russia for about 40% of its natural gas and about 25% of its oil supply. So there is a high dependency. From the Russian point of view, the logic seems to run like this. Since Europe needs Russia, surely the Europeans cannot put sanctions on Russia because that's the equivalent of punishing themselves. It's going to hurt the Europeans quite badly as well. So that's one reason why they are confident. Now, the third reason for confidence, this is where my role as an academic becomes more relevant, is that the history of sanctions seems to suggest they don't work. So we are talking about famous cases like sanctions on Cuba, North Korea, Libya, Iraq, and Iran. All these countries endured quite a bit of sanctions, and they haven't changed their foreign policy that much. So it suggests that sanctions may be less effective, partially because when you compare Russia to countries like Iran, North Korea, and so on, Russia is a far larger country, it's a far larger economy. So all these three reasons, let me summarize them: the large reserve, the energy independence, and the previous failures imply that what is likely to happen is that the West will just put token sanctions on Russia. Russia will weather it, and after a few years, the West will just accept a new status quo with Ukraine incorporated into Russia. So that was the original story, right? What happened? We have the benefit of hindsight. The sanctions that are imposed on Russia is a scale and has a comprehensiveness that hasn't been applied before. It's almost as if the history of the previous sanctions, we can throw it out because it doesn't capture the new scale that we have. Russia, just to quickly run through some of the things that happened, lost its central bank reserve because they are, in a sense, safe or located outside in the Western financial system, which the West controls, and they have cut it off. The West have went after the overseas assets of the oligarchs. The oligarchs, as you know, are the key group of supporters who financed Putin for many, many years. So when you go after the oligarchs, you're now hurting the key supporters of the regime, which is pretty significant. The next one, of course, is all the list of the private boycott. There is a long and extensive list of businesses that has pulled out of Russia. And the list doesn't just include your traditional suspects. So we're talking about the oil companies, the big banks, and so on. This includes things like luxury goods, providers of luxury goods, football clubs, McDonald's. A lot of commercial sectors have voluntarily pulled out. That has to hurt, right? Because it effectively locks and isolates Russia from the Western economic system. The other thing that we know now is that Europe seems to have gotten its act together. It has demonstrated it's willing to impose severe sanctions on Russia despite the cost to itself. One of the key players is Germany. Historically, Germany has been more friendly to Russia. It's part of the German traditional Ostpolitics foreign policy. After Merkel, the current the current leader, the replacement leader from Merkel, right? He's the head of a coalition. Two of the parties traditionally have pro-Russian foreign policy. That means they are traditionally friendly to Russia. It's remarkable. Right now, there seems to have a sea change in Germany's foreign policy. What do we know? We know that Germany now has infinitely shelved the Nord Stream pipeline, that they have changed its foreign policy orientation. That means there has something has changed in Europe. I'm going to make one more theoretical point, even though I know the answer is rather long. We need to think more carefully about the literature on sanctions. The previous literature, think in terms of the countries: Cuba, North Korea, Libya, Iraq, Iran, and now Russia. Most of these countries under sanctions are autocracies. It's actually, in international relations, there's something called a selection effect. Sanctions are rarely imposed on democracies. They are usually imposed on autocracy. And the logic for these two types of regimes are rather different. So we should be very careful when we talk about the impact of sanctions. It may have a very different impact on democracies compared to autocracies. And this is the part that is specific to Russia. The Russian claim they have a de facto alliance with China. So the argument goes like this: even if the West puts sanctions on Russia, it's fine. Instead of selling the oil to the West, the Russians can sell the oil to the Chinese, right? The idea that Chinese market can bypass the Russian loss of consumers in the West. That sounds like a way to immunize Russia from sanctions. I want to argue that's not true. Bear with me if I illustrate this. We know this from the literature on sanctions. When the West put sanctions on Russia, in theory, Russia can sell the oil to China. The problem is that when they are under sanctions and they turn to China and they want to sell the oil, obviously the Russians want to sell the oil at the market price that the West is prepared to pay. That, for the sake of argument, let's say the price is $100 per barrel. It's not, but let's assume it is. The Russians would like to want the Chinese to buy it at $100 per barrel. The Chinese will simply refuse to pay that. Their argument is, you have no choice but to sell it to me. So why should I buy it at $100 per barrel? They will impose a steep discount because the Chinese understand that they are the only viable consumer of that oil. Which means that even though Russia may get an exit option, find another customer for the oil, the sanctions is now hurting Russia because it's forcing them to accept a lower price for the oil compared to what they could have gotten if they were not under sanctions. That's one of the key reasons why you notice all the sanction targets, North Korea, Iran, and so on, even though they don't trade with the West, they always want the sanctions to be lifted, because without lifting the sanctions, they cannot get what they perceive as a fair market price for their oil, right? Because their potential customers understand that countries under sanctions have very little leverage. So this idea of leverage brings up another political science concept. So my audience will forgive me. I have a book when I talk about democracy, democratization and foreign aid. In this book, in one of the chapters, I talk about donor switching. So in simple idea, donor switching means when the West wants an aid recipient to democratize, they can put pressure using foreign aid to persuade aid recipient to democratize. So a target recipient may say, it's okay, if the West refuse to give me money, I can turn to China, look for Chinese aid as a way to avoid Western pressure using their aid. What I show with the concept of donor switching, and the details is in the book, is that even though you may be able to get Chinese aid, the dynamic and the leverage is weaker because you're now under pressure from the West. That means the Chinese may be able to impose and extract more economic concession as the price for getting their aid, even though they are which means that even if the aid recipients can find another donor, they may be forced eventually to democratize. Now the details are in the chapter, but my point is that the concept in sanctions and the concept in foreign aid share some overlap. Thank you.
China. So what this conflict mean for China if they choose to invade Taiwan, and what can China do to avoid the Western sanctions, as we have seen that West has imposed so many sanctions on Russia when they invaded Ukraine?
Sure. So your second question is, what can China do? So we will talk about that, right? So firstly, we are making an important assumption that China wants to invade Taiwan. If there was such a plan, my first sense is that such plans are probably put on hold for quite some time. The ferocity of the Western reaction seems to have caught the Chinese side by surprise. So what it means is that I suspect the Chinese Communist Party and the top leadership of the party is going to spend some time immunizing or insulating the Chinese economy from a potential Western sanction campaign before they will consider a direct invasion of Taiwan. So that's the first point. In making that claim, I'm already assuming that it's more difficult for China to invade Taiwan than it is for Russia to invade Ukraine, for a very, very simple reason, right? There's a direct land link between Russia and Ukraine. There is no direct land link between China and Taiwan. It's going to have to be either a sea invasion or an airborne operation. both of which historically and militarily are very difficult to conduct. So I'm assuming that the Chinese military is not capable of conducting a quick campaign to capture Taiwan before the West can react. So because of that, I'm assuming they are preparing for a long campaign where the Western sanctions is likely to hurt. This brings back to the other issue. That's the first point. That means there's a pause in the campaign to protect the economy. The second issue is this. Let's be clear here. Russian economy is nowhere comparable to the Chinese economy, because China is either the first or the second largest economy in the world. The Russian economy, despite the impression we have of Russia, I just before this interview, I just did a quick check of the GDP, right? According to the World Bank, back in 2021 figures, and I'm using 2021 because I don't want to conflate it with the 2022, which is the evasion and all the sanctions, so it will be a different issue. The 2021 figures from the World Bank, I want to remind my audience, right? Russia, for all its size, has a GDP that's smaller than Italy. Right? It's not a very large country economically speaking. China is on a different scale. China is much bigger. So the first question is, can the Chinese economy withstand that kind of sanctions that is imposed on Russia today? Maybe. But what price? Is this price acceptable to the CCP? Now I'm just going to go a little bit into the domestic politics of China, right? The Chinese Communist Party is not a democratic party. It doesn't have democratic legitimacy. So it can't claim a mandate of the people. What it likes to do is to claim performance legitimacy. Keep me in power because I'm generating economic growth for you. And they need the economic growth because the size of China, because it's one of the largest, one of the populous country in the world, means that the Chinese economy needs to grow at an extremely high rate, if only to ensure that the millions of young Chinese can get a job in a growing economy. So if the West cuts China off from Western financial system, many of the industries, many of the growth, the engines of growth will be cut off, which means that, even if you have a large war chest without the engines of growth, I think the Chinese Communist Party is going to have a hard time explaining the high unemployment that will generate, that will result. Because eventually, I think the Chinese middle class is going to ask the obvious question, right? Why are we fighting a war? Why is it I can't find a job? And it's going to be very difficult for the Chinese Communist Party to justify this. So what does this mean? Is China rich enough to withstand Western sanction? Probably. But the price may be way too high because there's a risk that the party may undergo potential unrest. And we know historically the Chinese Communist Party is very sensitive to any type of unrest, right? That means they are usually proactive. They are usually trying to clamp down. How do we know this? You watch how the Chinese Communist Party react to the unrest in Hong Kong. They try to shut it down pretty violently, right? And they also, how they react to the unrest in the Tiananmen protests leading to the massacre. And the other one that is more obscure, but also pretty significant. This is their treatment of the Falun Gong. This was a sect in China a long time ago, which managed to organize a surprise protest in the heart of the capital. And the persecution of the Chinese Communist Party was very strong about this, right? So in other words, I'm not sure, even if China is economically able to withstand the sanctions, they may not be willing to pay the political price of doing so. So that means that there's going to be a lot of calculation ahead. We can watch and see what the Chinese authorities do in the next few years. If they are likely to prepare for an economic siege, right? You should see a movement of funds, a campaign of disinvestment, that means withdrawal of funds from the West and shifting it to where China thinks is safer. It's not clear where else China can put their money if it's not in the West, right? Because there are not that many growth centers in Asia outside of China and outside the established liberal democracies.
Yeah. So coming to the United Nations, like you talked about China and Russia and Ukraine. So coming to the United Nations, why is it so that the United Nations have not been that effective in solving the geopolitical crisis, be it Afghanistan situation or the Russia-Ukraine crisis? Do we need some kind of structural and functional changes in the United Nations? Like, how do you see this?
Sure. The UN is a product of World War II. So after World War II, the 5 biggest powers basically set up a structure which we call today the United Nations, which emphasize state sovereignty and give a lot of voting privileges, including the veto in the Security Council of the United Nations. What it means is that the UN is not actually capable of acting independently of any of the wishes of any one of the permanent 5 members. So, for example, there has been an attempt to criticize Russia over the Ukraine in the Security Council. It is basically vetoed by Russia because it's one of the permanent members. So, in the way the UN is set up, is almost always paralyzed when the interest of one of the permanent 5 members is threatened. This is not new. Throughout the Cold War, every time the United States and the US key interests are affected, either the US or the Soviet Union will veto whenever their interest is affected. So the UN is actually not set up to be a key player, an active agent. It's more like an arena where the different states can exercise their influence. What does this mean? It suggests that the UN, and this is the old debate, right? The UN is probably overdue for reform, right? So, but again, the way the voting rules work is that even the reforms can be vetoed, which means that it's almost as if the organization is set up to fail, right? In the current era. This is not new. The UN Secretary General recently said, right, as a result of the Ukraine war, it looks as if the UN is going to be paralyzed for a very long time, right? Because any issue will be vetoed by either Russia or the United States. Right? So unfortunately, this is pessimistic for those of us who are looking for some kind of action from an international body. My advice is please don't expect this. It's not going to happen anytime soon.
Okay, sir. So how do you rate and analyze the ability of the West to defend democracy against autocracies? Kindly put some light on the same.
Sure. Now, this is an important question with many, many different angles. I'm going to focus on 2 implications from the perspective of the balance between democracy and autocracy. And I'm going to set one in the short run and one in the longer run. So let's start with the short run. I think that the situation in Ukraine is going to create immediate beneficiary of this war, and by which I'm referring to the rentier states other than Russia. Rentier state is a concept in political science to talk about states whose economy is mainly based on resource extraction. Basically, they are your typical oil or your gas dominant industries. Think of your Middle Eastern petrol states. Their main economy focus on about the export of oil to the West. The West needs Russia for gas and oil. What happens now is that with the sanctions, there is an immediate deficit. So they need to turn to somebody else in order to get the needed oil and gas. It's turning to, as far as I can tell, oil exporters like the UAE, United Arab Emirates, Venezuela, the Maduro regime. These are clear-cut autocracies. Now, I highlight Venezuela because it's a particularly interesting case. Because the United States, prior to the Ukraine crisis, had a policy towards Venezuela. It was trying to seek regime change for very good reason. Under Maduro, which is he's your typical oil-based dictator, he managed Venezuela so badly that effectively Venezuela today is less a proper state and has been described as a narco state. That means it's very much dominated by criminal gangs, right? Who engage in smuggling of state assets. Now, for the sake of an alternative supply, it seems like the Western countries are willing to ease up the pressure on countries like Venezuela because they need the money. What does this mean? It means that Maduro's regime may be able to survive for quite some time, right? That means the regime had just gotten a lifeline as a result of the Ukraine crisis. This seems to be a policy trade-off that the United States is willing to make, that the defense of democracy in Ukraine may require the sacrifice of democracy promotion in countries like Venezuela. Now, this is sad, but it's a reflection of a very practical consideration. The West doesn't have the resources to defend democracy everywhere, so it's trying to choose its battles. Now, in the longer run, a bigger question is about the long-term survival of democracies relative to autocracy. Now, I can understand why your audience and a typical layperson will think that democracies are weak, right? Because we can see with the transparency of information, the dissent and the criticism of the politics within democracy. United States today is infamous for its dysfunction. Like Congress can't seem to get anything done because of the gridlock in Congress. One thing we want to take note is that democracies handle information differently from autocracy. Democracies practice freedom of information, freedom of speech, which means that you can criticize the leader, you can criticize bad ideas openly. So this, from the outside, it looks as if democracies are weak, incoherent, fragile, unable to defend itself. By contrast, autocracies try to suppress information to impose the infamous expression, the party line, whatever the leader say, that's the policy everybody has to follow. From the outside, it looks as if countries like China are very united, very nationalistic. Everybody subscribe to one ideology. My point is, this may not be true. And I'm going to use an analogy from the private sector that some of your audience may be familiar with. Imagine you're working for a company. In one of the company, the boss allows you to criticize, to question the policies that are wrong. And in another company, you have to agree with the boss or else you are fired. So between these two companies, it's not that hard to imagine. In the long run, the company that tolerates some criticism is probably the company that is likely to survive in the future. Same logic, apply this to the survival of regime type. I would suggest to you, in the very long run, democracies are not as fragile as they would seem, precisely because they allow dissent. The policies they pursue tends to be more coherent, more well thought out, because it has been subject to criticism from multiple points of view. And this is one of the weaknesses of autocracy, right? They don't want to listen to their own people. So this is one hidden advantage of democracy. So with that, I will end there for now.
Thanks. So I would like to conclude by asking that what does the future holds for Ukraine and Russia? When, according to you, the crisis will be over and the life will be back to normal for people both in Russia as well as in Ukraine?
Sure. I'm going to answer the second half of your question first, which is about when things will be back to normal. At the rate the war is going, not for a very long time. I think Ukrainians the Ukrainian people, they understand by now, right? They will never be safe so long as Putin remains in power. Even if the war ends right now, that means there's a ceasefire, everybody agree to hang on to whatever territory they have. The badwill generated by this war is going to last for decades. You can ask the Georgians, you can ask the Chechens what they think about Putin's Russia today, because these are countries that have been invaded by Russia before. In the longer run, even if in the best case scenario, where the war ends, that means both sides reach a peace deal and some kind of acceptable arrangement to both of them, and both countries have to engage in reconstruction, I think the cost for the countries, for both countries, is going to be enormous. But there is a difference. The difference is that Ukraine can count on foreign aid and assistance from the West. It's not clear who Russia can count on. China, right? I just want to remind my audience, right, what Russia is in terms of its economy. is what we call in political science a rentier state. It's not very productive. It's dependent on one key sector, the export of energy, right? Oil and gas. And as I mentioned earlier in the interview, the Russian GDP is smaller than Italy. So the economic damage Russia has already suffered is going to take a long time to recover. My guess is the wiser people of Russia are going to draw clear political conclusion as to who is to blame for this particular sorry state of affairs. Now, in the near term, that means as the war proceeds, because the war has not finished yet, right? It depends on the military outcome of this the ongoing fighting. We know that the Russian original hope seems to be to capture Ukraine very quickly with a minimum cost. I think that that scenario is basically out. What does it mean? It means that now, if Ukraine can drag out the fighting, this war is becoming what we call in military strategy a war of attrition, right? It's going to be long, it's going to cost a lot, which means that it's now going to be very painful for Russia. Now, I'm going to take NATO as his word. NATO seems to make it very clear they will not intervene directly. That means no troops into Ukraine, no direct liability. This means that the balance of military forces on the whole favors Russia compared to Ukraine. Let's just say, for the sake of argument, that Putin decides to go for a scorched earth policy, to brute force, to try to win this as much as possible, to pay whatever price it takes to fully occupy Ukraine. So if it's a war of attrition, right? Even after Russia wins, it still have a problem. The problem is Ukraine is a large country, it's gigantic, right? It has a population of approximately 44 million, minus about 4 million of refugees which have already fled Ukraine. So now Russia will have a problem of trying to occupy a country with 40 million people, many of whom hate Russia right now. So this is going to be a huge problem for Russia, even if it wins. Now I could say more, but I'm going to summarize the key point I'm trying to drive across. This is a scenario we are facing now where Russia can win the war militarily, but it cannot win it for cheap. The outcome is likely to be a long and costly war. The issue is how much pain Putin is willing to subject Russia to in order to win. There's an expression from the Roman Empire, this idea of a Pyrrhic victory. That means it's a reference to a particular Roman conquest where they won, but it cost them so much. With the benefit of hindsight, it seems like it's not really worth fighting for. So it seems like Russia is heading towards a Pyrrhic victory scenario. They may win, but they may be quite sorry they tried to do this. So with that, I'm going to end on that particular note.
Thank you so much, sir, for your time. It was a pleasure having you on our show. And thank you so much for educating our audience about the ongoing Russia-Ukraine crisis. Thank you so much for your participation.
Thank you for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.